Formal incident briefings. Verified video proof. Direct accountability. Welcome to Bodycam Incident Reports.
Out here, there's no air support. I don't need a trident to do my job. You're not in Afghanistan. You're on my street. You're just another guy I have to process.
You think you're hard? Navy SEALs are fucking hard! Come on! Arrest me! Do your job!
Jax Holt understood the social dynamics of the American street long before he entered the pipeline for the Navy's special operations. As a 6'4" black man with a frame built over 2 decades of elite service, Holt was acutely aware that his physical presence was often interpreted as a threat. Since retiring from Navy SEAL Team 18 months ago, he had adopted a very specific way of moving through civilian life. He practiced a deliberate, controlled calmness. He spoke in a low, neutral tone. He was hyper-vigilant about his body language, knowing that a simple misunderstanding could escalate quickly for someone of his size and background. Before we analyze the legal and procedural breakdown of this encounter, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Adjustment to civilian life was a work in progress. Holt managed a non-profit that provided transition services for veterans and spent his evenings training at a private gym in an industrial sector of San Diego. On this Saturday evening, he was walking home after a late session. He was dressed in a charcoal hoodie and black cargo pants. Over his shoulder was a professional-grade tactical duffel bag. Inside was approximately 40 pounds of training gear, heavy iron chains, a weighted vest, and a specialized medical kit. Officer Michael Collins, 28, was patrolling the district. Collins was an officer who focused heavily on proactive interdiction. His training emphasized identifying anomalies in high crime or industrial areas after dark. When his cruiser's headlights caught Holt in the alleyway, Collins didn't see a decorated veteran. He saw a large man in the dark clothing, carrying a heavy, oversized bag in an area that had seen a recent spike in industrial thefts. The cruiser pulled sharply into the alley, the high beams illuminating the narrow space. "Officer," Holt said, stopping immediately. He kept his hands open and visible. He didn't drop the bag, knowing that a sudden drop could be mistaken for an aggressive move or an attempt to discard evidence. "I'm a resident. I'm just heading home from the gym." "Step over to the wall for me," Collins commanded, exiting the vehicle. He kept his hand near his duty belt, a standard tactical stance. "What's in the bag? It looks like it's got some weight to it." "It's gym equipment, weighted vest and iron chains," Holt replied. His voice remained steady, but he could feel the physiological shift, the adrenaline prickling at the back of his neck. This was a situation he had dealt with before, but the lack of legal basis for the stop was already apparent to him. Gym equipment, in this neighborhood, at this hour? Collins was skeptical. He had heard similar stories from suspects before. He moved closer, entering Holt's personal space to establish a position of authority. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You're matching a general description of a person we're looking for. I need to see your identification." "My ID is in my pocket. I am a retired serviceman," Holt stated. "But officer, you don't have a specific reason to detain me. I haven't committed a crime, and I'm simply walking on a public path." "I have a report of a suspicious person, and I've found you in the vicinity with a heavy bag," Collins countered. He saw the trident tattoo on Holt's forearm, and, rather than feeling a sense of professional courtesy, he felt a surge of friction. Collins had encountered military personnel before who questioned his authority, and his ego was beginning to dictate his procedural choices. "I'm not worried about your service right now. I'm worried about what's in that bag. Put it on the hood and step back." "I am not consenting to a search of my property," Holt said. His voice was no longer just neutral. It had taken on a low, vibrating intensity. He wasn't being defiant for the sake of it. He was a citizen who understood the Fourth Amendment and was watching an officer systematically ignore it. "Your lack of cooperation is giving me more reason to believe you're hiding something," Collins said. He reached out to grab Holt's arm to turn him toward the vehicle. It was a standard police maneuver, but Holt didn't move. He remained perfectly still, his feet planted, refusing to be physically intimidated. He looked directly at Collins, his eyes focused and intense. "Officer," Holt said, his voice carrying a weight that forced the younger man to hesitate. "I am telling you as a courtesy. Do not put your hands on me again." Collins didn't take the warning. He interpreted it as a challenge to his command. He reached for his handcuffs, convinced that his badge gave him the ultimate authority in that alley, unaware that he was pushing a man who had been trained by the government to handle much more significant threats than a patrol officer with a bruised ego. The interaction in the alley shifted from a standard Terry stop to a constitutionally questionable search. Officer Collins, operating under the assumption that non-compliance equated to guilt, decided to escalate the encounter. In the procedural framework of street policing, an officer must possess reasonable, articulable suspicion to detain and probable cause to search. Collins had neither. He had a man who did not fit his geographic expectations and who refused to display the deference Collins felt his uniform commanded. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Collins instructed, his tone hardening into a direct order. Jax Holt complied. He did not argue the law on the street, a standard safety protocol for any civilian, regardless of their background. He turned slowly and placed his palms flat against the cold metal of the patrol cruiser. Collins approached from the rear and took hold of the heavy duffel bag slung over Holt's shoulder. He pulled it off, the weight of the equipment causing it to drop faster than Collins anticipated. It hit the asphalt with a dull, heavy thud. Collins unzipped the main compartment and shone his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated thick iron chains, a weighted tactical vest, and resistance bands. Objectively, the items corroborated Holt's statement. He was returning from a workout. However, confirmation bias is a powerful psychological mechanism. Collins' mind, already committed to the narrative that Holt was a suspect, categorized the chains not as gym equipment, but as potential weapons. "You carry chains around at 8 in the evening?" Collins asked, a cynical edge to his voice. He shifted his flashlight, the beam sweeping over Holt's back and settling on his exposed right forearm. The light illuminated a faded, meticulously detailed tattoo, the Special Warfare Trident. Collins recognized the insignia immediately. In the hierarchy of law enforcement and military subcultures, the SEAL Trident carries a specific weight. For some officers, it elicits professional courtesy. For Collins, whose ego was currently engaged in a power struggle with the man standing in front of him, the tattoo represented a challenge. It was a symbol of a status that Collins did not possess, worn by a man who was currently refusing to submit to his authority. He chose to challenge Holt's background to reassert his control. "I see the ink," Collins said, his voice dropping into a dismissive register. "You guys think a few tours overseas makes you untouchable back here. Let me tell you how it works in the real world. You deployed with air support, million-dollar logistics, and a whole platoon watching your back. You played war with a safety net." Holt kept his hands on the hood. His breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. "Out here, on these streets, there is no air support," Collins continued. "It's just me. I deal with the real war every single night. I don't need a trident to do my job, so don't stand there thinking your military background means anything to me. You're just another guy I have to process." For 18 months, Jax Holt had worked to integrate into civilian life. He had attended VA counseling to manage his combat stress. He had built a strict routine to maintain his composure, but Collins' words crossed a line. It wasn't just an insult to Holt. It was a dismissal of the sacrifices made by the people he had served with. It was a patrol officer equating a domestic shift to a combat deployment, using his authority to belittle a reality he didn't understand. Holt's restraint reached its limit. He turned around. He didn't make a fast, aggressive movement toward the officer's weapon. He reached down, grabbed the handle of his unzipped duffel bag, and hoisted it before slamming it back down onto the asphalt. The iron chains inside clashed with a sharp metallic crack. Holt stepped directly into the center of the flashlight's beam. He threw his arms out wide, opening his chest, entirely ignoring the fact that Collins' hand was resting on his holstered firearm. "You think you're hard?" Holt yelled. The volume of his voice shattered the quiet of the industrial park. "Navy SEALs are fucking hard." Collins flinched, taking an involuntary half-step backward. The sudden escalation caught Collins off guard. He was trained to handle suspects who ran or physically resisted, but he hadn't expected this level of intensity from a man demanding to be arrested. "Come on!" Holt shouted, his arms still spread, staring directly into Collins' eyes. "Arrest me! Do your job, hero! Take me down!" Collins realized he had lost control of the encounter. The officer who initiated the stop was now visibly backpedaling, while the subject of the detention was driving the interaction. Collins gripped his radio microphone with a slightly unsteady hand. He had provoked a reaction, but he hadn't expected that level of intensity. Unsure of how to de-escalate the situation he had created, he defaulted to the only procedural tool he had left. He unclipped his handcuffs. "Turn around," Collins ordered. His voice lacked its previous authority. It was tight and reactive. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and obstruction." Holt did not resist. He dropped his arms and turned back toward the cruiser, placing his hands behind his back. He had crossed his own line, but he would not give the officer the legal justification to use physical force. As the steel ratchets of the handcuffs clicked closed around Holt's wrists, the alley fell silent again. Collins patted Holt down, his movements hurried and tense. He opened the rear door of the cruiser and guided Holt into the molded plastic seat. Collins secured the heavy gym bag in the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and put the car in gear. He did not speak to the man in the back. The initial adrenaline of the arrest was already fading, replaced by a quiet realization that he had just manufactured an arrest out of ego, and the man he was transporting was not someone who would quietly accept a misdemeanor charge in morning court. Have you ever heard the term contempt of cop? It's an unofficial phrase used in the legal community to describe an arrest made not because a citizen broke a law, but because they bruised an officer's ego. Let's look at how that plays out when the paperwork hits the supervisor's desk. The 15-minute drive to the division precinct was entirely silent. In the front seat, Officer Collins was already mentally drafting his incident report. He needed to articulate probable cause. To justify a charge of obstruction or delaying an officer, there must be a lawful underlying action that the citizen is obstructing. Collins knew that "he raised his voice at me" was not a crime. He needed to frame the initial detention as a legitimate investigation into a suspected burglary and Holt's refusal to be searched as the obstruction. In the back seat, Jax Holt sat quietly. His earlier outburst had passed. He wasn't struggling against the handcuffs or yelling through the plexiglass divider. Having spent years operating within strict chains of command and rigid rules of engagement, Holt understood that the street was not the place to argue the law. The street was where you survived the encounter. The precinct was where you began to dismantle it. When Collins escorted Holt into the brightly lit intake area of the station, the sheer physical disparity between the two men drew immediate attention from the other officers on shift. Holt was placed on a metal bench in the holding area, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He sat up straight, his expression blank, quietly observing the room. Sergeant Thomas Vance was the desk supervisor that night. Vance was a 22-year veteran of the department. He spent less time on the streets and more time managing the city's risk and liability. He reviewed use of force reports, audited body camera footage, and served as the first line of defense against bad arrests making it to the district attorney's office. Collins walked up to the intake desk and handed Vance the preliminary booking slip. Vance scanned the paperwork. "Obstruction and disorderly conduct," Vance read aloud, his tone flat. He looked past Collins to the holding bench, noting Holt's calm demeanor. Then he looked back at the arresting officer. "All right, Collins, give me the narrative. What was the original call?" "Suspicious person in the industrial park," Collins said, leaning on the high counter. "Matched the description of a prowler. I initiated a stop. The subject was uncooperative, refused to identify himself clearly at first, and then refused a pat-down for weapons. When I attempted to secure his bag, he became highly aggressive and started screaming. Vance picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk. He had read thousands of these reports. He knew how to listen for what wasn't being said. Did he match a specific description, or did he just look out of place to you? Vance asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Large black male, dark clothing, carrying a heavy bag in an area with recent commercial burglaries, Collins recited. That's a demographic, Collins, not a suspect description, Vance corrected dryly. He looked at Holt's ID card, which Collins had placed on the counter. He saw the military designation. You detained a retired Navy SEAL walking with a gym bag. Did you have a warrant to search the bag? No, Sergeant, but given his behavior and the weight of the bag, I felt a weapons check was justified for officer safety. Vance sighed. The officer safety exception was a valid legal tool, but it wasn't a blank check to bypass the Fourth Amendment. And how did he obstruct you? Did he physically resist the search? Did he fight you? He stepped aggressively into my space and started yelling at the top of his lungs. Collins defended himself, his frustration leaking into his voice. He was trying to intimidate me. It was disorderly conduct, and it delayed my investigation. Did he lay hands on you? Vance pressed. No. Did he resist when you put the cuffs on? No. Vance put the pen down. The administrative picture was becoming uncomfortably clear. An officer initiated a stop based on a generalized profile, attempted a search without probable cause, and when the citizen verbally asserted his rights, albeit loudly, the officer made an arrest to regain control of his own scene. It was a textbook contempt of cop arrest. Vance stepped out from behind the desk and walked over to the holding bench. He stood in front of Holt. Mr. Holt, I'm Sergeant Vance. I'm reviewing your intake, Vance said, keeping his voice professional and neutral. Can you tell me your version of what happened in the alley? Holt looked up. He didn't complain about the tightness of the cuffs. He spoke clearly, outlining the facts with the precision of someone trained to give post-mission debriefs. I was walking home from a workout. Officer Collins detained me without reasonable suspects. The transition from a street-level encounter to an administrative crisis happens the moment the body camera footage is uploaded to the precinct server. Sergeant Thomas Vance didn't just take Jax Holt's word for it. He placed Holt in a holding room, removed the handcuffs as a preliminary de-escalation measure, and walked directly into the watch commander's office. He was joined by Captain David Reynolds, the shift supervisor. Together, they pulled the digital file from Officer Collins' Axon camera and watched the interaction on a high-definition monitor. In the sterile environment of the office, stripped of the darkness and the adrenaline of the alley, the footage was legally indefensible. They watched Collins initiate the stop. From a procedural standpoint, a Terry stop requires reasonable, articulable suspicion that a specific crime is occurring. Captain Reynolds noted immediately that carrying a heavy gym bag in an industrial area does not meet that threshold. It is a demographic assumption, not a legal justification. They watched Collins escalate the encounter. When Holt calmly asserted his Fourth Amendment rights and refused the search of his bag, Collins interpreted the invocation of constitutional rights as suspicious behavior. This is a common but legally fatal error in street policing. The footage then showed Collins dumping the bag's contents and specifically targeting Holt's Navy SEAL background, insulting his service to provoke a reaction, and then came the explosion. The audio peaked on the camera as Holt's voice reverberated through the speakers. Navy SEALs are fucking hard. Reynolds paused the video right as Collins reached for his handcuffs. The captain leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Tell me what crime was committed here, Sergeant," Reynolds said, his voice flat. "None," Vance replied immediately. The subject was loud. He was angry. But the First Amendment protects a citizen's right to verbally challenge and even yell at a police officer, provided they are not issuing a direct physical threat or inciting violence. Holt kept his distance. He didn't raise his hands. He invited the arrest. "It's First Amendment retaliation," Reynolds confirmed, recognizing the exact legal doctrine that plaintiffs' attorneys use to dismantle police departments in federal court. Collins didn't arrest him for obstruction. He arrested him for contempt of cop. He arrested the man because his feelings got hurt when the civilian didn't submit to his ego. The administrative reality was bleak. If this went to court, Collins would not be protected by qualified immunity. Qualified immunity shields officers from personal liability only if they do not violate clearly established constitutional rights. The right to be free from a retaliatory arrest for exercising free speech is one of the most clearly established rights in American jurisprudence. 10 minutes later, Sergeant Vance walked back into the holding area. Jax Holt was sitting on the metal bench, rubbing his wrists where the steel had bitten into his skin. He was perfectly calm, his breathing steady, the adrenaline spike completely managed. "Mr. Holt," Vance said, maintaining a strictly professional distance, "I have reviewed the body camera footage. The charges against you are being dropped. There is no paperwork for you to sign. You are free to leave, and I will personally drive you home if you wish." Holt stood up. He didn't smile, and he didn't express relief. He operated with the cold, administrative precision of a man who understood exactly how bureaucratic systems function. "I don't need a ride, Sergeant," Holt said, his voice returning to the low, measured baritone. "I need a pen, a piece of paper, and your business card." Vance handed them over without hesitation. Holt wrote down the time, the date, and the names of the officers involved. "I am formally requesting that all body camera footage, dash camera footage, and dispatch audio related to this incident be preserved," Holt stated. "I also want the incident report number and the contact information for your Internal Affairs Division." He wasn't acting like a suspect who had just caught a break. He was acting like a plaintiff establishing a chain of custody for evidence. He took his gym bag, which another officer had brought in from the cruiser, verified the contents, and walked out of the front doors of the precinct into the cool night air. Down the hall, Officer Collins was sitting in an interview room waiting for his union representative. When the rep, a retired detective named Harris, finally arrived, the mood was grim. Harris had already spoken to Captain Reynolds and watched the video. Harris sat down across from the young officer and closed his notebook. He didn't offer comfort, he offered the procedural truth. "You didn't just make a bad stop, Mike," Harris said quietly, looking Collins in the eye. "You bypassed the Fourth Amendment, you tried to play mind games with a Tier 1 veteran, and when he didn't back down, you arrested him on camera out of pure spite. The department isn't going to stand behind you on this. You handed this guy a winning lottery ticket, and the city is going to have to pay it." By 9 a.m. on Monday, the legal machinery of accountability was already in motion. Jax Holt did not hold a press conference, nor did he take to social media to vent his frustrations. Having spent his career operating within highly structured, strategic environments, Holt approached the violation of his civil rights as a tactical problem that required a methodical, overwhelming response. His attorney filed a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 in the United States District Court. The complaint was a masterclass in procedural dismantling. It did not rely on emotional appeals. It relied on the rigid framework of the Constitution. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, specifically an unlawful investigatory stop devoid of reasonable, articulable suspicion, and an unlawful search of property. Furthermore, it alleged First Amendment retaliation, arguing that Officer Collins effectuated a custodial arrest strictly because Holt exercised his protected right to verbally challenge police misconduct. When the city attorney's office received the filing, accompanied by a formal preservation demand for Officer Collins' body camera footage, an emergency risk assessment meeting was convened. The city attorney, the chief of police, and the head of internal affairs sat in a secure conference room and watched the encounter in the alley. The legal consensus was immediate and unanimous. The city had no viable defense. In civil rights litigation involving law enforcement, municipal attorneys rely heavily on the doctrine of qualified immunity, which shields officers from personal liability unless they violate a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. The city attorney recognized immediately that qualified immunity would not survive a motion to dismiss in this case. The right to be free from a search without probable cause, and the right to verbally criticize police without being subjected to a retaliatory arrest, have been clearly established by the Supreme Court for decades. Collins had not made a split-second good-faith error in a rapidly evolving, dangerous situation. He had systematically escalated a consensual encounter into an arrest based purely on a bruised ego. Simultaneously, the Internal Affairs Division opened a formal administrative investigation. Because Holt's lawsuit explicitly cited a pattern of proactive policing that relied on demographic profiling rather than behavioral indicators, IA was forced to audit Collins' previous patrol logs. The data revealed a troubling, statistically significant pattern. Over his 3 years on the force, Collins had a disproportionately high rate of initiating Terry stops that resulted in no citations or arrests, but consistently involved escalation, use of force, or complaints of verbal abuse. The department had previously dismissed these complaints as the unavoidable friction of aggressive patrol work. Now, viewed through the lens of the Holt incident, they formed a clear pattern of constitutional negligence. The city moved to settle the lawsuit before it could enter the grueling public phase of legal discovery. They offered a substantial financial payout, standard practice for municipalities looking to quietly resolve liability. Jax Holt rejected the initial offer. He made it clear to the municipal mediators that his objective was not a personal financial windfall, but institutional correction. 6 months after the incident in the alley, a settlement was finalized. The city agreed to a $450,000 payout, every cent of which Holt directed into a trust fund dedicated to providing pro bono legal representation for veterans facing housing or legal crises. However, the financial component was secondary to the equitable relief Holt demanded. As part of the binding agreement, the police department was required to overhaul its training curriculum regarding consensual encounters, investigatory stops, and First Amendment protections, specifically focusing on de-escalation when an officer's authority is verbally challenged. For Officer Michael Collins, the administrative consequences were terminal. The Internal Affairs investigation concluded with sustained findings of unlawful detention, unlawful search, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The chief of police signed his termination order. Due to the clarity of the body camera footage and the sheer weight of the constitutional violations, the police union declined to take his termination to binding arbitration. Collins was stripped of his badge, and his decertification was forwarded to the state licensing board, effectively ending his career in law enforcement permanently. Jax Holt returned to his routine. He continued to manage his nonprofit, continued his early morning workouts, and continued to carry the weight of his past with quiet discipline. He had utilized the legal system exactly as it was designed to be used, transforming a moment of gross professional overreach into a permanent, systemic correction. This incident forces us to confront the reality of how authority is applied on the street. Jax Holt was able to dismantle an unlawful arrest because he possessed the psychological discipline of a Tier 1 operator and the resources to hold the system accountable. But what happens when the person in that alley isn't a highly trained veteran? What happens when it's a teenager or someone who doesn't know the exact parameters of the Fourth Amendment? Do you think the settlement and the termination of one officer are enough to change the culture of a department? Or is it just the cost of doing business for the city? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We need to have a serious conversation about what happens when the badge is used to demand respect, rather than to uphold the law. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We will keep analyzing these encounters, strictly by the facts, because understanding your rights is the first step to protecting them. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.
This incident file is closed. For more objective footage breakdowns, please like and subscribe. Thank you for supporting Bodycam Incident Reports.